In the quiet neighborhood of Springwood, two families lived side by side. The first family was Linda, a hard-working single mother, and her 12-year-old son, Brian. The second family was David, a quiet single father, and his daughter, Sophie, who was also 12. Linda and David didn't talk much, but they were friendly neighbors. Their children, Brian and Sophie, became best friends. They walked to school together, played after school, and even built a small clubhouse in Brian's backyard. One afternoon, Linda looked out the window and saw the two kids painting their clubhouse. They were laughing and having fun. Linda smiled, but then felt a little worried. They're growing up so quickly, she thought. Brian and Sophie shared everything with each other, secrets, dreams, and fears. One Saturday, they were sitting in the clubhouse, talking. Brian asked, "Sophie, do you ever wonder what it'll be like when we're older? Like, living on our own?" Sophie thought for a moment. "Not really. I like how things are now. Don't you?" "Yeah, I do," Brian said, but then he added, "Sometimes I think about things. Like stuff we see in movies. Do you ever think about that?" Sophie shook her head. "No." "Why?" Before Brian could explain, they heard Linda calling, "Brian, it's time for dinner." They left the clubhouse, but Brian kept thinking about the question. Brian couldn't stop thinking about what he had asked Sophie in the clubhouse. The movies he had been watching lately made him curious about things he didn't fully understand. Sophie, on the other hand, didn't think much of it. She was happy playing and spending time with her best friend. One day after school, they were walking home when Sophie said, "Brian, why do you watch those grown-up movies? My dad says kids our age shouldn't watch them." Brian shrugged. "I don't know. They're just interesting, I guess. Don't you ever wonder about that stuff?" Sophie looked at him curiously but shook her head. "No, I think it's boring. I like watching cartoons better." Brian laughed. "Cartoons are fun, but I like learning about new things too." They reached their houses, and Sophie waved goodbye. "See you tomorrow," she said, running to her front door. A few weeks later, on a rainy Saturday, Brian and Sophie decided to watch a movie together in Brian's living room. Linda was at work, and David had gone out for errands. They scrolled through Brian's movie collection, and he picked a film he thought would be exciting. "I don't know about this," Sophie said when the movie started showing scenes she wasn't used to. "It's just a movie," Brian said, trying to act cool. "It's not real." But as they watched, Sophie started feeling uncomfortable. She looked at Brian and noticed he seemed a little different, more serious than usual. "Do you think people really do stuff like that?" Sophie asked quietly. Brian shrugged again, but didn't say anything. The movie ended, and they sat in silence for a while. "Let's go to the clubhouse," Brian finally said. Sophie nodded, and they ran outside in the rain. In the safety of the clubhouse, Sophie asked, "Brian, why are you so curious about this stuff?" "I don't know," Brian admitted. "I just want to understand it." Before they could talk more, Sophie's dad called her. "Sophie, come home, it's time for dinner." Sophie left, but both of them were left with more questions than answers. As days turned into weeks, Brian and Sophie's curiosity grew. They didn't talk about the movie openly, but the thoughts lingered in their minds. Brian started watching more of those movies when his mother wasn't home, and Sophie found herself wondering why Brian was so drawn to them. One afternoon after school, the two friends were in Brian's living room again. Linda was working late, and David was still at his office. Brian turned on the TV and suggested they watch another movie. "Are you sure this is a good idea?" Sophie asked, hesitant. "It's fine," Brian said. "It's just a movie. We're old enough to handle it." Sophie sat down reluctantly. This time, the movie was even more explicit than the last one. Sophie shifted uncomfortably in her seat, while Brian stared at the screen, his curiosity growing stronger. Do you ever wonder what it feels like? Brian asked suddenly. Sophie looked at him, surprised. What do you mean? Brian hesitated, but then said, you know, the stuff they're doing in the movie. Sophie didn't know how to respond. She felt confused and embarrassed, but also curious. Maybe, she admitted quietly. The next weekend, their parents were both busy again. Brian and Sophie were playing in the clubhouse when Brian brought up the topic. Do you want to try it? He asked nervously. Sophie's eyes widened. What? No. That's crazy. Brian looked down, embarrassed. I'm sorry. I just thought maybe you'd want to know what it's like too. Sophie didn't say anything at first. Then, after a long silence, she said, I don't know. It feels wrong, but I'm curious too. They sat in silence for a while, unsure of what to do. Eventually, Sophie said, let's just forget about it for now. Brian nodded, but the thought stayed in both their minds. The next few days were awkward between Brian and Sophie. They avoided talking about what had happened in the clubhouse, but the tension lingered. At school, they acted like everything was normal, but whenever they were alone, the unspoken curiosity hung in the air. One Friday, Linda told Brian she would be working late again, and David mentioned he'd be attending a meeting that evening. Brian and Sophie found themselves alone in Brian's house after school. What do you want to do? Sophie asked, trying to sound casual. I don't know, Brian said. He hesitated before adding, do you want to watch another movie? Sophie frowned. I don't think we should. It just makes things weird. Brian nodded, but after a while, he said, what if we just talk about it? No movies, no anything. Just talk. Sophie hesitated, but eventually agreed. Okay, but only talking. They went up to Brian's room and sat on the bed. At first, their conversation was light and innocent, but it quickly shifted to the things they had seen in the movies. What do you think it would feel like? Brian asked again. I don't know, Sophie replied, her cheeks turning red. I guess there's only one way to find out. Just as they both leaned closer, nervous and unsure, they heard the front door slam. Brian? Are you home? Linda's voice echoed through the house. Brian and Sophie jumped apart, their hearts pounding. It's my mom. Brian whispered. They scrambled to look normal as Linda walked upstairs. She opened the door to Brian's room and looked at the two of them suspiciously. What are you two doing? Nothing, Mom, Brian said quickly. Linda narrowed her eyes, noticing their flushed faces and nervous behavior. I think we need to have a talk, she said, her voice firm. Linda sat down on the edge of Brian's bed, looking at both kids with concern. You two seem nervous. Is something going on that I need to know about? Brian glanced at Sophie, who avoided eye contact. No, Mom. We were just talking, he said, his voice shaky. Linda studied them for a moment, sensing there was more to the story. Talking about what? Just stuff, Brian mumbled. Linda sighed, deciding to be direct. Brian, Sophie, you're both at an age where you might start feeling curious about things you see on TV or hear about from friends. But some things aren't appropriate for kids your age. Sophie looked down, embarrassed, while Brian fiddled nervously with the edge of his shirt. Linda continued, I need you to be honest with me. Have you been watching movies that you shouldn't be watching? After a long pause, Brian finally nodded. Yes, Mom. I'm sorry. Linda's expression softened. Brian, those movies aren't meant for kids. They can confuse you and make you think about things you're not ready for. Sophie, does your dad know about this? No, Sophie said quietly. He doesn't know. Linda nodded. All right, here's what we're going to do. Sophie, I'm going to call your dad, and we'll talk about this together. But first, I want to make sure you both understand why this is serious. That evening, David came over after Linda called him. The four of them sat in the living room. Sophie and Brian sat silently while their parents spoke in low voices. David looked at his daughter. "Sophie, I trust you, but I also need to remind you that there are boundaries. Watching those kinds of movies can lead to questions you're not ready to answer." Linda added, "We're not angry at you, but this is a serious matter. You're both still young, and it's our job to guide you." Brian and Sophie nodded, feeling the weight of their parents' words. After the discussion, Sophie and Brian avoided each other for a few days. The tension was still there, but they both felt embarrassed about what had happened. Their parents, now more alert, had decided to monitor them closely. Linda and David even talked about coordinating their work schedules so one of them would always be around when the kids were home. One afternoon, Brian decided to apologize to Sophie. He knocked on her door, and David let him in. Sophie was in her room, reading a book. "Sophie," Brian began, "I'm sorry for everything. I think I messed up by showing you those movies and asking weird questions. I didn't mean to make you feel uncomfortable." Sophie looked at him, her expression softening. "It's okay. I was curious too. But I think we both learned something." Brian nodded. "Yeah, we're too young for that stuff. Let's just go back to how things used to be." Sophie smiled. "Okay. Friends?" "Friends," Brian said, shaking her hand dramatically, and they both laughed. Meanwhile, Linda and David were talking over coffee in Linda's kitchen. "I never thought I'd have to deal with this so early," Linda said, shaking her head. "Me neither," David replied. "But I guess it's a reminder that we need to be more involved. They're good kids, but they're growing up, and the world is full of things they're not ready for." Linda sighed. "We can't just shield them from everything, though. We need to teach them how to handle it." David nodded. "Agreed. Maybe we should have more open conversations with them about these things, so they don't feel like they need to hide anything from us." As they talked, they both realized how much they had in common as single parents. The following weekend, Linda and David decided to have a joint family meeting. They invited Sophie and Brian to sit with them in the living room. The atmosphere was serious but calm. Linda started. "We're here because we care about you both. What happened recently was a wake-up call for us as parents. It's not just about rules, it's about making sure you understand why certain things aren't good for you right now." David added, "We're not perfect parents, but we want to do better. From now on, we'll be more open with you, so you feel comfortable asking us questions instead of looking for answers in the wrong places." Brian hesitated before speaking. "Mom, Dad, I'm sorry for what happened. I didn't think about how it might hurt us." Sophie chimed in, "Me too. I guess I didn't realize how serious it was. But we understand now." Linda smiled softly. "That's all we want, for you to learn and grow. But remember, curiosity is normal. What's important is how you handle it. Always come to us if you're unsure about something." David nodded. "And as parents, we'll work harder to guide you. We'll be around more, and we'll make time to talk about anything you're curious about." As time went on, both families grew closer. Linda and David started sharing responsibilities, like taking turns dropping the kids off at school and helping with homework. Their efforts created a strong support system, not just for Sophie and Brian, but also for each other. One evening, while walking home from school, Sophie looked at Brian. "Do you think our parents are becoming friends?" Brian laughed. "Maybe. They're spending a lot of time together." Sophie smiled. "It's not a bad thing. I think we're all learning how to be a better family." The experience taught everyone a valuable lesson. Parenting is about more than providing, it's about guiding and being present. Children need understanding and open communication to navigate the challenges of growing up. For Brian and Sophie, the incident became a turning point. They learned the importance of boundaries, trust, and leaning on their parents for guidance. And for Linda and David, it reminded them that raising children is a journey best taken together, with patience, love, and understanding.